This new year, our focus is on the mitzvah of tikkun olam, repairing our broken world. And our world is broken. It's ripped apart by hatred, divisiveness, and violence. People are suffering, and we can help. And believe it or not, the biggest threat is our indifference. Let's turn indifference to making a difference. Picture these individuals in your mind's eye, real people like you and me and people we're close to. Picture a dentist who volunteers at free clinics, a doctor who cares for terminally ill patients, a volunteer who coaches a local youth league, siblings who look out for one another, an elder who is vivacious and enthusiastic about living. Sound familiar? It could be a description of one of us, a relative, or a close friend. Only 2 short years ago, on October 27th, 2018, these individuals were among 11 people brutally butchered in Pittsburgh because they were Jewish and at Shabbat services at the Tree of Life Synagogue. The shocking incident stopped us in our tracks. 11 Jews were murdered, 6 more were seriously injured. We held a memorial service at our temple the evening of that tragedy. Over 1,000 people gathered, Jews and non-Jews, mourning the tragedy together. Over 20 of my non-Jewish clergy colleagues joined me in leading prayers from this bima. We sat in communal shiva. We felt connected in our pain. Amidst the terrible darkness of this senseless hatred against Jews, we felt the support of compassionate non-Jews. Their support gave us strength and resilience. Their support made us feel understood and valued. There are more real people out there, more people just like us and the people we love. Picture these individuals: a dedicated community activist, a speech therapist, a graduate student, a teacher, a loving mother, a doting grandfather, an active member of a sisterhood, a hard-working father. They were also real people who lost their lives because of senseless prejudice. They lived in Charleston, North Carolina, and they too were butchered in their house of worship. In June 2015, 9 human beings were murdered in the fellowship hall of the Emmanuel AME Church. They were shot by a different gunman, this time a racist intent on killing them because they were black. Both shootings had the same evil intention, a massacre at a synagogue, a massacre at a church, a massacre of Jews, a massacre of black people, all people just like us. When we discuss anti-Semitism or racism, it can't be an abstract discussion. Real people like us are the victims. This is not a political issue. Judaism doesn't sanctify anyone's party affiliations. Good people may disagree on how to solve problems of bias and prejudice, but good people acknowledge when real problems exist. We don't put our head in the sand. We take action. Who are the monsters able to carry out horrible crimes against people like us? How do we recognize them? In 1963, Hannah Arendt wrote a book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. You may recall the interesting subtitle, The Banality of Evil. Arendt identified a distinct new kind of evildoer. Adolf Eichmann was a leading official in Nazi Germany's SS, a main player in implementing the final solution. Eichmann didn't look like an easy-to-identify monster. He lived a normal family life. In Argentina until 1960, this family life, calm, relaxed, normal, integrated in his community, until Israeli agents finally captured him. And then at his trial in 1961, Eichmann was accused of crimes against the Jewish people, against humanity. Arendt didn't describe Eichmann as a bloodthirsty criminal. She described him as a thoughtless bureaucrat, passionate only in his desire to please his superiors, a non-thinking functionary capable of horrendous evil. This new concept, the banality of evil, the idea that evil can be ordinary, commonplace, and thoughtless, was entirely new. Until then, theologians and philosophers believed that evil deeds are spurred by passion, hatred, envy, pride, or ambition. Arendt pointed out that during the Holocaust, evil emanated not only from a person with a gun, but also from people who were apathetic, people who upheld the systems and the structures which enable evil. Arendt affirmed that evil grows less out of our dark passions and more from indifference, apathy, and silence. Consider for a moment the Shoah, the Holocaust. Most Germans never killed a Jew themselves. Most Germans never shattered a window on Kristallnacht. Most Germans didn't turn their neighbors over to the Gestapo. In fact, most Germans never joined the Nazi Party. Indifference is what allowed the Holocaust to occur. Rather than get involved, the German people stayed silent, apathetic, and indifferent. The majority of Germans looked the other way and did nothing. In 1999, Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, was invited to come and speak at the White House. He told his personal story of the summer of 1944, when as a teenager in Hungary, he, his father, mother, and sisters were deported by the Nazis to Auschwitz. When they arrived, Elie and his father were selected by SS Dr. Joseph Mengele to do slave labor, and the rest of his family were immediately murdered in the gas chambers. Elie and his father's daily life at Auschwitz included starvation, brutality, the constant struggle against overwhelming despair. In January 1945, as the Russian army drew near, Elie and his father were hurriedly taken on what's now called the Death March. They were forced to march with other surviving prisoners long distance in the bitter cold, with little or no food, water, or rest. Those who couldn't keep up were shot. About 1 in 4 died on the way from Auschwitz to Buchenwald. And there, Elie's father would ultimately die right before the end of the war. When Elie was finally liberated by American troops, we know his story. He moved to Paris, he became a journalist. Later, he settled in New York. He wrote 40 books, harrowing chronicles of his Holocaust experience. But in 1999, when he was at the White House, he began his talk not about his personal story. Instead, he opened his remarks with the question, what is indifference? He then explained that etymologically, the word indifference means seeing or making no difference. Then he defined indifference as the state in which the lines blur between crime and punishment, cruelty and compassion, good and evil. Wiesel admitted that indifference can be tempting. Even more than that, he said indifference can be seductive. When we are indifferent, it's easier to look away than to engage. Indifference elicits no response. To be indifferent to suffering is what Wiesel says makes we humans inhuman. Wiesel acknowledged the heroes of the Holocaust, the heroes were not indifferent. The heroes stood staunchly against evil. The heroes did everything they could to save Jews. The heroes made a difference. But then he asked the White House, why were there so few supporters of Jews? Why was there a greater effort to save SS murderers after the war than to save their victims during the war? Why did some of America's largest corporations continue to do business with Hitler's Germany until 1942? Wiesel added that for the person who is indifferent, his or her neighbor are of no consequence. Their lives are meaningless. Their anguish is of no interest. Indifference reduces the suffering of another to an abstraction. Wiesel reminds us how few stood with us and with others who were targeted by the Nazis. Most people were indifferent and did nothing because it wasn't their problem, because it matched their own prejudices, because they didn't want to risk their standing in society, because they were afraid, or even because they opposed the Nazis but weren't willing to get involved. We're not living in Nazi Germany or anything like it, but we do live in a country with problems. Some of these problems victimize all of us equally, but some problems target specific groups. Anti-Semitism targets us. We have to combat hatred against Jews aggressively whenever and wherever it arises. We can't be indifferent to anti-Semitism. But we also need to be alert when prejudice assaults others. And let's have a clear definition. Prejudice is when someone is in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. Race, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, gender, disability, or sexual orientation. Prejudice against any person is a violation of God's will. We must confront our preconceived negative judgments about a person or a group of people. When we watch that video of George Floyd, we must make sure that we weren't indifferent. Judaism teaches us over and over again, every human being is created in the image of God. Every human being is created equal. Love your neighbor as yourself. Speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. Defend the weak and the fatherless, the Torah tells us. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Show mercy and compassion to everyone. When there are prejudicial acts against others, it's not just the victim's problem, it's everyone's problem. Anti-Semitism is our problem. It's the world's problem too. And when the second massacre occurred at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, we need to know that members of the Emmanuel AME Church traveled from Charleston, North Carolina, to lend their emotional support to show solidarity in Pittsburgh. Polly Shepard. Polly was a survivor of the first shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church. She went to Pittsburgh she shared hugs and tears with Carol Black. Carol Black, who survived the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. Polly held Carol's hand as Carol described hiding in a closet while the gunman murdered her 65-year-old brother. Polly had a connection to Carol's brother who had been murdered because she had met his wife, Beth, when Beth had organized a trip to Emmanuel Church to support Polly's community after that tragic massacre. Polly spoke to the gathering of survivors at both the church, the survivors from the church, the survivors at the synagogue. She spoke and she shared these words. It's sad and troubling that in the United States of America, Jews and African Americans are united by having been slaughtered in their houses of worship. We share many bonds, but it's unfortunate that this is one of them. Polly's reverend then said right afterwards, from the depths of our hearts, we say, you are not alone. We are here for you. COVID-19 dominates our lives, but there are other big problems to address as a community. The Bible tells us we are our brother's keeper. Saying nothing, doing nothing in the face of senseless violence doesn't make us neutral. It makes us guilty. When I was in seminary, my teacher, Rabbi Lebo, often reminded us that the job of the rabbi is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. And it's time to be uncomfortable. It's time for action. Not being prejudiced, not being racist isn't enough. As a Temple community, we joined Stephen and Adrian Reedy when they led a 3-part dialogue called Moving from Racism to Gracism. As a local biracial couple, they shared painful personal experiences with us. Those of us who listened validated their feelings, even while solutions to the problem are up for debate. Stephen and Adrian asked 4 things of us: look, listen, lament, learn. We have to be willing to look, to open our eyes and acknowledge that a problem exists. We have to be willing to listen, to consider views different from our own. We have to be willing to lament, to feel empathy for victims. And we have to be willing to learn, to take steps that offer our support. These 4 L's, look, listen, lament, and learn, they are the powerful opposites of indifference. They're the first action steps we can take. But when talking to Stephen and Adrian, I suggested to them we add a 5th L, love. It isn't enough to just look, listen, lament, and learn. We have to manifest action. We have to recognize love as an action verb, not as a noun. Love moves us to concrete acts of support and kindness. Love helps us overcome discomfort with people who are different. Look, listen, lament, and learn, and then with loving in kindness, move from indifference to making a difference. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, he showed us how. He was one of the leading Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, so much so that for rabbinical students, for cantorial students, Heschel's writing is required reading throughout our training. But even more important than anything Heschel wrote, anything that was in his literary work, the thing that most stood out was that it was Heschel who always was standing beside Martin Luther King Jr. to lead Jewish support against black injustice. Together, Heschel and King prayed with their feet. Heschel's words to his fellow Jews during those marches are inspiring. He'd say over and over again, let us dodge no issues. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. Let us make no compromise with callousness. If you open your Torah at the beginning, in Genesis, if you open up the Torah and you start to study, you realize the Torah tells us that God created different kinds of plants, different kinds of animals. It says it over and over again in the story of creation. But the Torah also makes it clear that God didn't create different kinds of human beings. Genesis records God created the first human being from whom all other human beings are descendants. As Jews, we must speak against all forms of hatred. If we stay indifferent, we become accessories to oppressive deeds. The rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and Europe has us all concerned. Large acts of anti-Semitism don't just happen. They follow days, weeks, and years of smaller but daily acts of anti-Semitism. After 2,000 years of persecution, expulsions, violence, the genocide of 6 million Jews, anti-Semitism is rightly called the oldest hatred. And what do we say? Never forget, never again. But history is filled with documented acts of hate and violence based on bias and intolerance against race, ethnic diversity, religious freedom, and gender distinctions. And we must apply the standard of never forget, never again to the victims of all injustice. 2,000 years ago, the Talmud informed us, you are not required to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. There's a personal intersection between anti-Semitism and racism. Mistrust and division on both personal and political levels exist between Jewish people and people of black heritage, unfortunately, within our country today. And I believe that working to strengthen those relationships between Jews and people of color is a way to reduce anti-Semitism. As oppressed people, we are natural allies. But this doesn't happen unless we reach out. We have to reach out to our black friends with support. We have to be willing to look, listen, lament, and learn. We have to look at their situation, listen to their needs, lament their circumstances, learn their perspective. And then we have to summon the courage to act on their behalf. Indifference to both anti-Semitism and racism is not an option. Scott Kramer is here today. Scott, you got to raise your hand at least so people here. I know the cameras can't catch you. I'll put you on video later. But Scott is Vice President of our congregation, Chair of the Social Action Committee. And we have been working on initiatives of learning and action to address injustice when it's right in front of us. So I want you to reach out to me or reach out to Scott or Alexander, who's our temple president. Reach out to us right after the holidays. Discuss some options that we're participating in within our community. This new year, we have to perform the mitzvah of Tikkun Olam. We have to help repair our broken world. There's important work to be done. And we need to remember that all human beings are created equal and in the image of God. May God help us set aside indifference so we cry out against all prejudice and hatred, cry out against violence and oppression. Instead of indifference, this new year, let's make a difference. And in doing so, may we stand united for freedom, justice, and peace in our world. The Shana Tova, a happy, healthy, and peaceful new year. Amen.